In ancient Britain, the elderly King Lear decided to give up his power and divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters. He planned to give the largest territory to the daughter who professed to love him most. Lear was sure this would be his favorite, Cordelia.
Which of you shall we say doth love us most?
The eldest, greedy Goneril of Albany, pretended to love her father very much.
Sir, I love you more than words can wield the matter.
Lear's second daughter, Regan of Cornwall, swore she loved him even more than Goneril.
She comes too short.
But Cordelia, sickened by their deceit, said only that she loved him as a daughter should.
I love your majesty, according to my bond. No more, no less.
So young, so untender.
At this, Lear flew into a rage. He disowned Cordelia and gave his lands to Goneril and Regan.
Thy truth then be thy dower.
When Lear's oldest friend, the Earl of Kent, tried to intervene, Lear banished him on the spot. But Cordelia's suitor, the King of France, admired her honesty and asked her to marry him. Cordelia prepared to sail for France, reluctantly leaving her father in the care of her cunning sisters, Goneril and Regan.
The jewels of our father, with washed eyes, Cordelia leaves you.
But Kent did not leave. He disguised himself and took a job as Lear's servant, hoping to protect him from his scheming daughters. Lear had no palace of his own now, so he took a train of 100 knights, his fool, and his new servant to stay with Goneril. But Goneril had changed. She was no longer a loving daughter.
Here do you keep 100 knights and squires, men so disordered, so debossed and bold, that this our court shows like a Ritius inn?
How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child.
Bewildered by her harshness, Lear decided to visit Regan. He sent his servant ahead to the Earl of Gloucester's palace, where she and her husband were staying. He, his knights, and his fool followed, galloping through the night.
I have another daughter who I am sure is kind and comfortable.
But when they arrived, Lear was outraged to discover that Regan and Cornwall had put his servant in the stocks, nor would they come out and greet the king.
They durst not do't, they could not, they would not do't.
Then Goneril arrived, and the spiteful sisters told Lear he must give up his 100 knights and live as a pauper.
What need you, 5 and 20, 10, or 5?
What need 1?
I gave you all.
Lear had no daughters left to turn to. His heart bursting with sorrow, he rushed out onto the heath in a pitiless storm.
O fool, I shall go mad.
The Earl of Gloucester sadly watched Lear go. He too had suffered at the hands of his children. His youngest son, Edmund, had told him that Edgar, his favorite son, planned to murder him. This was a lie, but Gloucester had believed it, and had driven Edgar out. He did not know that Edgar was living nearby in a hovel on the heath. It was into this hovel that Kent and the fool managed to drag King Lear for shelter. Edgar cowered in the shadows, delirious with cold.
Have his daughters brought him to this pass?
Back at the palace, Gloucester overheard Regan and Goneril plotting to kill King Lear. He rushed out at once to warn Kent.
I have overheard a plot of death upon him.
But on his return, Gloucester paid dearly for this act of loyalty.
I shall see the winged vengeance o'ertake such children.
Cornwall brutally tore out one of the old man's eyes.
See it shalt thou never.
A shocked servant tried to intervene, wounding Cornwall. Urged on by Regan, Cornwall took out Gloucester's other eye.
Out, vile jelly!
But Cornwall's wound proved fatal. Regan was delighted. Now she would be free to marry Gloucester's son, Edmund, whom she loved. But Goneril loved him too. Jealous of Regan, she wrote to Edmund suggesting he kill her husband Albany, leaving her free to marry him.
This news is not so tart.
But then news came that Cordelia had raised a French army and landed at Dover. Reluctantly, the two sisters set aside their battle for Edmund and prepared to fight Cordelia. They marshaled their troops and set out for Dover with Albany and Edmund.
Combine together against the enemy.
Sweet Lord!
Kent had also heard the news and set out with Lear, hoping to reunite him with Cordelia. Blind Gloucester was on his way to Dover too with Edgar, who had found him lost and in pain on the heath. Outside the port, the two old men met, Gloucester, now eyeless, and Lear mad with misery and fatigue. As the war drums rolled, Cordelia's servants came to take Lear to the French camp. King Lear slept through the long battle. When he awoke, Cordelia and the French army had been defeated. Unaware that Edmund had issued orders for his and Cordelia's deaths, Lear rejoiced. The idea of imprisonment with Cordelia seemed like heaven compared to freedom with Goneril and Regan. Meanwhile, Albany had discovered Goneril and Edmund's plan to kill him. He declared Edmund a traitor and ordered him to defend himself. An armored man challenged Edmund to fight. Goneril and Regan watched as Edmund rapidly began to lose to the stranger. Only after he had delivered a mortal blow to Edmund did the stranger remove his helmet and reveal himself to be Edgar. As Edmund lay dying, Edgar told him how he had been reunited with their father, Gloucester, just before his recent death. A servant brought news that Goneril had poisoned Regan, and then, realizing Edmund would not live, had killed herself too. Edmund was conscience-stricken at last. With his final breath, he told Edgar to send a reprieve for Lear and Cordelia. But it was too late. Lear's dear Cordelia had been hanged. Albany and Edgar watched in horror as Lear stumbled toward them, carrying her body in his arms.
Ho, 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 ho! O you men of stones! Had I your tongues and eyes, I'd use them so the heavens' vaults should crack.
Beside himself with grief, the old king fell into a faint. Edgar tried to help, but Kent stopped him. Lear had lost everything. What he had not given away had been taken from him. Even his fool had been executed. Kent, who had stayed by the king's side throughout his torments, knew Lear no longer had any hope of finding peace in the world. It was with relief that he watched his friend's life gently ebb from him, his arms around his only true daughter, Cordelia. Albany tried to persuade Kent to take the crown, but the old earl had no use for life without Lear. So Edgar became king and tried to rule with honor in memory of two wronged old men, his father the Earl of Gloucester and his liege, King Lear.
This weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say.